Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Allen, and I'm the president of the Brookings Institution, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you to today's very important event. It's a somber subject, the opioid crisis in America, vulnerable groups, law enforcement, and international supply. Now, today's webinar is the second in a two-part series that complements the recent launch of our latest Brookings project, the Opioid Crisis in America, Domestic and International Dimensions. Indeed, the project could not have come at a timelier moment. For while the United States reels from COVID-19 as a pandemic, the epidemic of opioid use disorder, or OUD, continues to ravage our country, tragically robbing us of the lives of nearly 500,000 Americans since the year 2000. The opioid epidemic has revealed critical weaknesses in the current U.S. drug policy, as well as existing health and welfare systems unable to avail themselves to the lower income population. And we've learned a lot about that. Now, recognizing the urgency of this health crisis, Brookings Senior Fellows Vanda Felbab-Brown and Carol Graham have convened policy stakeholders at the local, state, and federal levels, as well as members of the public who are on the front lines. Together, they previously published 5 powerful essays, and 4 new ones are coming out today. Indeed, I believe they're already posted. They illustrate the multifaceted ways the opioid crisis has devastated families and communities, and they detail policy solutions. Today, they, alongside a panel of experts to be moderated by Claire Galofaro of the Associated Press, will share their latest findings on vulnerable groups, domestic law enforcement of the opioid crisis, and international supply control measures. We are indeed honored to welcome as today's keynote speaker, Senator Rob Portman. For over 20 years, Senator Portman has served in the U.S. Congress on behalf of the great state of Ohio. A member of the Finance, Homeland Security, and Foreign Affairs committees, he's been a tireless leader on dealing with the opioid crisis. And among his many achievements, he's passed laws such as the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, CARA, in 2016, which authorized over $181 million in funding for treatment, prevention, and recovery programs. He also introduced and passed bipartisan Synthetics, Trafficking, and Overdose Prevention, STOP Act, which aims to stop trafficking in synthetic drugs like fentanyl and carafentanyl from countries like China. So before I turn the floor over to Senator Portman, who is making his way to our event from the Senate floor, a brief reminder that we're on record today and we're streaming live. Please feel free to submit your questions via email at events@brookings.edu. That's events@brookings.edu, or use our Twitter hashtag opioid crisis. That's hashtag opioid crisis. So welcome, Senator. It's a great pleasure and an honor to have you join us today for this crucial conversation. And we thank you again for your commitment to such a vital issue for the United States and for engaging with us today. So sir, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. It appears that we are either waiting for Senator Portman to still come from the Senate floor, or perhaps he's already online and we are waiting to resolve voice connection.
And he'll be coming in by phone today as well.
Indeed. Well, perhaps while we are waiting for the connection to happen, I can speak a little bit about the project. And first of all, I want to acknowledge President John Allen's support for the project and his enormous leadership of Brookings that enables work like our opioid work to be conducted. So thank you, John, for your support and for your enormous leadership. And
Senator,
it appears that the Senator is here.
Thank you.
Great to have you with us today.
Of course. John, are you ready?
Yes, sir. I have introduced you. I talked about
Oh,
the...
thank you. Listen, I apologize. I was giving a speech on the floor of the Senate, and the people ahead of me took a little longer than expected. Can you imagine that? A little filibuster on the Senate floor?
Well, we're honored to have you with us. And
well, it's great to be with you.
The floor is yours, sir. The floor is yours.
Well, listen, I have looked over the Brookings briefing that you gave me for this event, and it just sounds like you've had tremendous speakers and great information that's been provided. And I don't want to repeat what other people have said, so I'll try to be brief. But let me make a couple of points, if I could. One is that the opioid crisis, as you know, is really an addiction crisis, and it's not just about opioids. It's about a cocktail of drugs, typically in my home state of Ohio and around the country now. And really this has been true for the last several years. There's been increasing mixing of, for instance, fentanyl, which would be the deadliest of opioids. The fentanyl is synthetic, of course, mostly coming from China. But a mix of that with psychostimulants like crystal meth, which has made a comeback in my state, unfortunately, and cocaine. And it affects now every community. I would say that for a while there, opioids was a problem, maybe as a percent of the population per capita, more in the rural areas, even suburban areas, less in the inner city as compared to other drugs. That's really not true in Ohio anymore, in part because of cocaine was more prevalent there and now crystal meth. And so it's hard to talk about this issue, in my view, as just the opioid crisis. Rather, I would say it's an addiction crisis. And of course, it includes other kinds of drugs and alcohol as well. But the point is, it's become broader than just opioids or just certainly fentanyl, prescription drugs, and heroin. Second point, which is an obvious one, I suppose, from the people you've heard from today already, we're in trouble. You know, we are once again seeing a trend line that is very concerning. We don't have all the data yet, and we won't for some time, but we believe that over the last 4.5 months, as we have gone into this pandemic on the COVID-19 part of this, that we have an increase in every respect, addictions, overdoses, overdose deaths, and all the consequences of that. So we see the same thing in the area of behavioral health, I suppose, with regard to increases in suicide. We also see the same thing with regard to other issues of isolation, I would say, anxiety, depression. But there's no question that in my home state of Ohio, in most of our communities, we've seen an upsurge, an increase in the overdose and overdose deaths. And again, typically in my state, it's a combination of fentanyl and other drugs, usually psychostimulants. And this is very concerning because know that, you know, we were actually making progress. And everybody on this call who has been involved in this issue is to be commended because we sort of found consensus around putting more funding and more focus on treatment and recovery and on prevention, and on being sure Narcan was more widely available, all of which I think was actually working in 2017, which would be the worst numbers nationally. You know, we were losing 72,000 people a year, something like that, to overdoses, and again, opioids being the primary cause. In my home state of Ohio, in 2018, we had a 22% decrease in overdoses in 1 year. And that was very encouraging because, again, all these efforts that so many have made at every level, I've been focused on the federal level, and we have provided billions more, roughly $5 billion more at the federal level, $5 billion more just on treatment, recovery, some on prevention, some on Narcan. But it's beginning to pay off, or it was beginning to pay off. Then in this last year, 2019, we had basically a plateauing, a slight increase, but at least we weren't back to the 2017 levels. And by the way, in 2017, we had an increase that was consistent with every year for the past 20 or so years. In other words, we had increases in every year, more and more overdose deaths. But we were making progress and at least flattening out more or less in 2019. And now in 2020, unfortunately, we see a resurgence. I think the data will bear that out as we get it in the coming months, and it'll be a grim statistic because we will see that you know, we're back to 2017 levels, even above it slightly in some of our cities in Ohio, based on a month-to-month comparison. You know, for instance, June 2017 versus June 2020, in some of our communities, we are doing worse today than we were during the height of the opioid crisis. So that's not good news, and I know that it's, it's something that's been talked about earlier today, I'm sure, but it's reality, and we have to face it, and that's why we can't stop in terms of what we were doing that was starting to work. Some of my colleagues were becoming weary of the amount of money we were spending and the effort, but I was able to tell them, look, it's making a difference. Now it's important that we convince them to redouble their efforts, because we're not going to get out of this without going back to what has worked. I'm the author of what's called the CARA legislation, along with Sheldon Whitehouse, bipartisan bill that has provided much of this funding, but also been very supportive of the other appropriations and some of the other legislation like the STOP Act, which has been effective in keeping some of the fentanyl from coming into the United States because it was coming through our mail system, and that's been curtailed to a substantial amount, but now it, of course, is being transshipped to other places like Mexico and then being brought in. The point is, ultimately, this problem can't be solved just by interdiction, law enforcement, and prosecutions. It has to be solved on the demand side. Both are important. Things like the STOP Act have increased the cost of fentanyl on the street, which is good. It's 50 times more powerful than heroin, but less expensive in most places. So the idea is if you make it harder to bring it in, at a minimum, you're going to see an increase in the cost, which is part of the way we begin to make progress on the use of this deadly opioid. So again, we have made progress, but we're now in danger of taking a step backwards. And I think it's really important that we do everything we can to try to redouble the efforts that we're working. And that's effective prevention. That's the new kinds of treatment options we were looking at, including getting people into treatment through some very creative ways to what we call our quick response teams around the country. Some of these teams include social workers and treatment providers, as well as law enforcement and EMS. And a lot of that was starting to work to get people into treatment and to begin to address these issues. And then we had COVID-19. So one thing we are looking at in the COVID-19 legislation is some ways to immediately push back. In the CARES package, as some of you know, that was passed, not CARA, but CARES, which was passed a few months ago, 2 months ago now, I guess, we were able to provide some additional funding to push back against this opioid and other drug addiction issue. We were also able to change some of the federal reimbursement for telehealth. And I will say that in this next piece of legislation, I hope we can encourage that and maybe even make permanent some of those changes, because one positive thing I'm hearing around the state and around the country is that telehealth has worked very well in some cases. When people can't be at traditional in-person addiction treatment services, it's been helpful for them to be able to recover from this debilitating disease. And so we need to encourage Congress to continue to expand telehealth and other delivery options. It's also been a lifeline to patients to be able to take some of their medication home with them rather than to have to continue to go to a doctor or even to a pharmacy. And that's why in our legislation we provided some flexibility with regard to prescribing. I recently introduced bipartisan legislation to ensure that in this next bill we have a continuation of the telehealth and the e-prescribing. It's called the TREATS Act, Telehealth Response for E-Prescribing Addiction Treatment Services. If folks have not looked at that yet, I hope they will. It basically bolsters and makes permanent the telehealth options by allowing doctors to prescribe low abuse drugs that are used for treating substance use disorder to patients. It also does a lot to prevent fraud, but as an example, patients would be able to get Suboxone to be able to continue their treatment even if they can't go into the doctor. It also would pave the way for billing audio only or telehealth visits, which under current Medicaid, Medicare provisions are difficult to do. So I think that the TREATS Act would be a great thing for us to get in this next piece of legislation to help us preserve some of the progress we have made, even during this pandemic, in trying to figure out how to combat the addiction crisis when people can't come together and gather. So again, John, thanks for having me on today. I know this is frustrating for a lot of people who are on this call who have been working on this issue for years to hear that, the the news is not as good as we would hope, and that in fact we are seeing some retrenchment and seeing, unfortunately, higher rates of addiction and overdoses in some of our communities. But we cannot give up. We have to continue to do what we've done, which works, redouble those efforts, and as we come out of this pandemic, use telehealth even more where it's effective, to be able to have another tool to be able to address it. So thank you, John, and I look forward to answering any questions that might come up, and appreciate your having me on today.
Thank you, Senator. We're honored that you could join us. And Dr. Felbab-Brown will take over now, sir. And we have a panel that will follow you. And thank you for all that you're doing on behalf of the American public and the international community on this incredibly important area. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, John. Take care.
Good day to you, sir. Good day. Be healthy.
Okay.
Thank you
John.
very much. Thank you very much, Senator Portman. This is Vanda Felbab-Brown. I'm a senior fellow at Brookings and one of the co-directors of the Brookings Opioid Project. Like President John R, I'm enormously thankful for your joining us today and for your dedicated effort and leadership in responding to the opioid crisis and substance use disorder more broadly, as you so powerfully reminded us. And indeed, sir, you have been one of the primary leaders in getting important funding to effectively addressing policy. Policy can have good design. If it lacks the resources, it will be limited in effectiveness. And you, sir, have done so much in getting the funding in. And I'm also enormously grateful to you for the new funding that you have been talking about for telemedicine in response to substance use disorder. Perhaps I can start my question with that, with the issue of funding. You mentioned the impact of COVID, or at least the coexistence of the COVID pandemic and substance use disorder. We are already seeing that COVID will have dramatic impact on the finances of many states. And of course, Medicaid has been one of the principal mechanisms for funding substance use disorder. What are your thoughts on how the federal government can further step in and help with assuring that appropriate funding will be there? You mentioned telemedicine and e-prescribing. Are there other elements that can be funded through the federal government in the context where use and disorder might grow and state finances and state capacities for financing treatment have gone down?
Well, Dr. Brown, first, thanks for your report from last month, which is very helpful and kind of a broad overview for people, if you haven't read it, the opioid crisis in America, dimensions both international and domestic. But you are right. Medicaid is leaned on, as you may know, in the first series of bills, in actually, I guess, 2 of the 4 or 5 bills that have already been passed. We did address Medicaid in part because of the state financial issues, so increased the FMAP, which is the percentage that the federal government pays of Medicaid funding. I spoke to our governor about this as recently as Monday of this week, and of course he's very pleased that that percentage, the federal percentage, was increased so that the states would have the ability to use their funds for other purposes that they need so badly right now with COVID. And we'll probably do that again in this next piece of legislation, is to extend that FMAP, in other words, a more generous federal participation in Medicaid. And I think that's necessary, unfortunately. People have talked about more money for state and local. What I like to focus on is, where is the real need, and target it as much as possible, not just to give money out that is generic, but give it out where it's needed. And certainly Medicaid right now is one of those areas. The other funding you talked about, Congress does its own appropriations process separately from the COVID-19 bill, and so we're working hard to get the funding in for the opioid response grants, of course, and also for the CARE legislation. That's the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, as opposed to the CARES legislation. And I think we're in good shape there. I think people realize we can't pull back on that funding right now, given what's happening. But those are all good points. I have a question for you, Dr. Brown, and it goes to why we're in the situation we are in, where, again, in some of my counties, we have higher overdose rates than we've had since the terrible years, 2017, for example, which was our high water mark in Ohio and in most places around the country. And my answer to that typically has been that, isolation creates these issues. People are asked to quarantine, and it leads to more anxiety or depression and more drug use. And then also you can't, have face-to-face with your recovery coach, as an example. But what is your thinking about this? Why have we seen this increase in overdose and deaths? If you agree with that, and maybe you have some national data that is counter to that, but I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you, sir. I think that your initial assessment is where I would come in as one of the causes. I would highlight that we often need to give time to analyze data, and the data is fresh. The COVID has suppressed information, and the COVID has suppressed access to information and to research, to in-person research. So we are all speculating. But certainly it's very consistent that when people are facing traumatic circumstances, loss of jobs, other high trauma, that they will have need for medication. And for some people that might mean self-medication and unfortunately developing substance use disorder. One of the papers that we are releasing today is on US veterans and the very high rates of substance use disorder among veterans because of trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, difficulties in adjustment from the war scenario to post-war scenario being back at home. Similarly, around the world, we see the rise of substance use disorder in many places that often have strict policies, but that have been going through high trauma situations, such as the Middle East, North Africa, other parts of Africa. War zones are often associated with substance use disorder for the very same underlying reason of the psychological stressors for which mental health treatment, mental health care is often not available. And so this links back to, I think, our need to beef up not just substance use disorder mechanisms, but very strongly focus on making mental health treatment and mental health support and care far more available to residents, people in the United States than has often been the case, and then links to insurance availability and other issues. And of course, that means not dropping our eyes from supply, whether it's supply related to domestic pharmaceutical companies or domestic producers. And I would love to hear your thoughts, sir, on how more better to regulate pharmaceutical companies, or whether this is related to supply coming from abroad. In this case, China, or via Mexico as well. So, sir, if I can ask you on both of these issues, dealing with the suppliers, whether they are legal suppliers, but supplying drugs in ways that are causing substance use disorder, pharmaceutical companies, pharmacies, doctors, and supply that's illegal and coming from abroad.
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me just comment quickly on your other answer, which I thought was very good. I think, well, certainly there's a correlation between a bad economy, unemployment, a sense of despair, and substance abuse. And I think one of the things that is necessary as part of the COVID response is to, get at the underlying problem of the healthcare issue, which is the pandemic, in order to get people back engaged. And that's engaged in work, whatever it is. It's engaged in, their school. It has to be done safely, but I think for those of us concerned about mental health and substance abuse, that's part of the answer. And I don't know how you feel about that, but I think the isolation, the lack of socialization or socializing is, we are social beings. And I think that is part of what I see happening, at least in some of our communities back home, is that people are turning to this out of a sense of despair or a sense of loneliness or a sense of isolation. I won't ask you to comment on that now, but maybe you could later. Absolutely right in terms of the supply side. The pharma companies and the prescription drugs that are pain medication still have a long way to go. Has there been improvement? Absolutely. In Ohio, we've had probably a 25% reduction in prescribing opioids, but it should be more than that. In my strong view, things like dental procedures of, taking out wisdom teeth as an example, there should be no need. There should be only in extreme circumstances with extreme pain. Otherwise, we should go back to what we used to do in this country, which is not use opioids for that, but rather use ibuprofens and aspirin and Tylenol and other things. So I do think there's still a great opportunity to avoid some of the tragedies. I know two families now in Ohio who have lost a child to in their cases, both a heroin overdose, having started on opioids because of a wisdom tooth being taken out when the girl and the boy were in their teens. And obviously we've seen this with all kinds of accidents and injuries. So there's more to go there. We have legislation, we call it CARA 2.0, and some of that legislation has been passed, but some of it has not, and one of it is a 3-day limit on prescribing, and I think that is appropriate. I know we get pushback from some people on this, particularly some docs in the who believe that for certain kinds of procedures is necessary. But I will say, after 3 days, you can get permission from your doctor to get more. But I think there should be a 3-day rule. I'm not talking about chronic pain. I'm talking about the kind of acute pain you have after a procedure. And if that 3-day rule were in place, I think that would make a big difference. And I think it should be done on a state-by-state basis, but I think there should be national incentives to get to a 3-day limit. I think that would help a lot. So there's more to be done there. In terms of China, you're absolutely right. It continues to be a huge source of fentanyl. I probably shouldn't even talk about this on this call because, God forbid, it should happen. But the production of fentanyl in the United States, and for that matter, even in Mexico, is minimal. Thank God. And but it's so cheap and so pure coming from China. And so my hope is we can continue to curtail that supply, as we have done with the STOP Act, the Interdict Act, and some other legislation that I've been proud to co-author. But ultimately, again, it's going to be a demand issue. If there's a strong enough demand, people will figure out a way to make it and package it, as they're doing in Mexico now, and shipping it. And then the other drugs, as you know, there is an effort right now among our DEA and military and so on to stop some of these flows of drugs, particularly from Central and South America, like cocaine and heroin. And that's good. And I'm strongly supportive of that. Crystal meth, pure crystal meth from Mexico is our issue in Ohio. It's not the meth that's cooked in your basement or in the trailer anymore. It's more deadly, it's more pure, and it's less expensive. And in some places in Ohio, on the street, you can get crystal meth for less than you can get anything, including marijuana. So it's a problem. The supply is a problem. And getting that, curtailing that supply to getting the costs up will help. But ultimately, it's about reducing that demand.
Well, thank you, sir. I am mindful of your time. Perhaps I can ask you one last question, if that's consistent, given that we are at 3 o'clock.
Excellent.
Thank you. You spoke early on about the need for data. That data is vital for developing the right responses, for providing enough funding, for understanding what policies are working or not working. And you very importantly emphasized that earlier in our conversation and in your keynote. And many countries, particularly in Europe and Australia, have become very effective in using wastewater monitoring to obtain data on drug use. Unfortunately, the United States has been lacking in adopting such very powerful policies that can reach a very wide spectrum of population, and thus truly understands how patterns are shifting and how patterns are shifting on a very rapid basis. What are your views on the United States adopting such wastewater monitoring? Are there any ways that the federal government, the Senate, can incentivize that? And what are your views on why the United States has been so slow in adopting this highly effective measure?
Wow, it's a fascinating question. We happen to have the EPA water expertise in Ohio. That's where the district office is that handles wastewater and other drinking water issues. And they do a lot of fascinating research there, and I think that is worth pursuing. I need to know more, Dr. Brown, about how the Europeans or the Australians have collected the data and how they've used it. That would be very interesting. Are they using it more as kind of a forewarning so that they know where to move their resources, or are they doing it sort of more after the fact to figure out what has happened? Can you tell me anything more about that?
Well, I believe it's a combination of both, and it's principally meant for response. But of course, the response is hopefully early on and proactive, and enables responding on a faster basis than, say, 1 year or year and a half lag. So, for example, it's only now that CDC has understandably been able to put forth overdose data for 2019. One of the advantages of the wastewater monitoring is that the analysis could be done faster and responses could take less than a year and a half of lags.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll be also very delighted to connect you with colleagues on this project to give your office more information. Indeed, one of the primary goals of the project was to collate state-of-the-art understanding of the various issues. There are now 10 papers on all kinds of dimensions of both domestic and international, as well as directed policy recommendation, but also hopefully to stimulate conversation with crucial leaders like you. So I'll be very delighted to follow up and connect your office and you, sir, with some of my colleagues who are much more versed in the issue than I am.
Well, that would be great, Dr. Brown. I would appreciate that. Megan Harrington's on the line with us today, who's done a terrific job spearheading our efforts, and we would be very interested in learning more about it. One of my great frustrations is the lag time, and I mentioned the 2019 data. We just got it. And here we are 6 months, 8 months into the year, and I understand why it takes a long time. I will say we collect data every single month from certain communities in Ohio to just keep a feel for what's going on. We get it from the coroners, the medical directors, and that's helpful for us. But the collection of data is a challenge. This is so fast moving and fast changing. We weren't talking about fentanyl 5 years ago, and we certainly weren't talking about the mix of fentanyl and crystal meth as an example. We weren't talking about crystal meth until several years ago. And when I first got involved 25 years ago in this area, maybe more than that, I started my own anti-drug coalition in Cincinnati. It was all about cocaine and marijuana. And so times have changed, and the drug choices will change, and the danger and the risk will change even within the same drugs. And so the data is really important to be able to respond, as you say, hopefully in real time, if not proactively. Thank you very much for having me on, General Allen and Dr. Brown, and good luck with the rest of your virtual conference.
Thank you very much, sir. Enormous honor to have you join us, and thank you again for your tremendous leadership.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that, and thanks for what you do every day, and let's keep it up.
Thank you. As President John Allen indicated at the beginning of our webinar today, Brookings has been running a project on opioids for over a year. This is the third public element of the project. This is webinar 2. We have had a month ago another webinar with stellar presentations of the first set of papers that focused on issues of prevention, treatment, state responses, funding, as well as the regulation of the pharmaceutical industry, and featured some of my stellar colleagues on the project, such as Dr. Kilmer, Dr. John Calkins, and Humphreys, Carol Graham, who is a co-director of the project. So today we are really, after that, on July 10th, we released the podcast with another set of authors, such as Professor Paul Weiss, who is also one of the co-authors of the paper that's being released today. It's a very powerful paper on women with opioid use disorder and children among the highly vulnerable communities, a paper written by Professor Weiss, Dr. Gia Ahmed, and Dr. Joshua Sharfstein. I highly recommend it, a very powerful, important, and poignant piece. And I'll be now handing over to my colleague from Associated Press, Claire Galofaro, who's been a leading journalist, investigative journalist on opioids, to moderate our panel and to have a conversation with the rest of us about some of the other papers being released today. Claire, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. It is a real honor to be here today and a part of this discussion about this really extraordinary challenge facing our nation. I have been reporting about opioids for most of my career, and over the years, I have met so many people who have lost so much to this crisis. I have met people who've lost years of their lives before they found recovery. I've met people who've lost limbs from infections, from using dirty needles. And of course, I've met so many people who've lost loved ones, so many parents who've buried their daughters and their sons. One mother who I always think of lives in Massachusetts, and she lost her son very early on in the epidemic, back when most Americans still thought of substance use disorder as a moral failing. She did too. She was mad at him. She said, "Why don't you just stop?" And then he died. And she came to this sort of horrifying realization over the years that he'd had a disease that she hadn't understood. And she'd failed him. And we all had, really. She kind of made it her penance to create this club of mothers and fathers who'd buried their children to drug-related deaths. It started out small, but then, of course, grew and grew. And there are thousands of them now. They came up with this plan a few years ago to send photos of their dead sons and daughters to the White House on Valentine's Day, because they thought if people in power could see their faces, really look into their eyes, then surely they would feel the full might of American society behind them, that we would resolve to really fix this, no matter the cost. And unfortunately, they have been disappointed again and again. They feel that progress has been incremental, that funding has been insufficient. And thousands, tens of thousands, of course, continue to die every year. We just learned a few days ago that the death count in 2019 was 71,000 American lives. It is easy, I think, to fall into despair, to look at this as a problem that is so big and so out of control that it's insurmountable, which is why I'm so grateful to be here today to talk about, of course, how we got here, but most importantly, to search for a path forward. Each of our presenters will describe their research for a few minutes, and then we will open it up to questions and discussions. The papers and the full bios are available at brookings.edu/opioid crisis. The hashtag for this event is #opioid crisis. Today, you will be hearing from John Hudak about vulnerable populations, specifically veterans. John is the Deputy Director for the Center for Effective Public Management and a Senior Fellow in Governance Studies. His research examines questions of presidential power in the context of administration, personnel, and public policy. He has written several books, the topics ranging from the history of marijuana to the distribution of federal grants. His PhD is from Vanderbilt University. Peter Reuter will be talking about domestic law enforcement. He is a professor of public policy and criminology at the University of Maryland. In 2019, he received the Stockholm Prize in criminology for his research on drug policy. He received his PhD in economics from Yale. Then Vanda Felbab-Brown will be discussing the international supply chain. Vanda is an award-winning scholar and senior fellow for the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. She is the co-director of the Brookings Opioid Epidemic Series. She is also an expert on international conflicts, insurgency, organized crime, urban violence, and illicit economies. She has a bachelor's in government from Harvard and a doctorate in political science from MIT. So we are in really impressive company today. I should stop talking. Thank you all so much for joining us, everyone out there who's joined us virtually, and to our panelists. John?
Sure. Thank you, Claire, both for moderating and for what were really informative and touching remarks about your experience working on this issue, which for those of you who are unfamiliar with Claire's work is really some of the best content you're going to find from any journalist writing about drug policy that's out there. As Claire had mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit today about veterans and what's happened to the veterans community in the opioid crisis. I think veterans are oftentimes overlooked when we think about vulnerable populations in a variety of contexts, and nowhere is that more problematic than when we're talking about opioids. According to SAMHSA in 2018, 562,000 American veterans reported opioid misuse in the previous year. That gives you an idea of the magnitude of how this has impacted this community. Not simply 562,000 veterans reporting misuse in their lifetime, but in the previous 12 months from that survey. In 2019, Secretary Wilkie, VA Secretary Wilkie, noted that veterans are 2 times as likely as the general population to die of an accidental drug overdose. And while that drug overdose category includes non-opioid related deaths, it certainly includes a large number of opioid related deaths or overdose deaths in which opioids were part of a combination. Of course, for veterans, for anyone in the population, but especially for veterans, opioid use disorder, specifically substance use disorder generally, is compounded by other issues, such as chronic pain, which is of course disproportionately experienced by veterans relative to the general population, and of course PTSD, which has an outsized impact on veterans by virtue of their service to this country, particularly newer veterans who are coming from wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. This is also compounded by stigma. Stigma affects mental health care in a variety of contexts. It is especially important in the context of substance use and substance abuse. And within the military and within veterans communities, there is an ongoing stigma around getting help for mental health care and for substance use. This is especially compounded by some of the rules that exist within the VA system about talking about substance use and substance abuse. And so part of the solution to this is not just throwing money at the issue. It's not just designing programs that are going to be helpful and effective, but also combating issues that are very specific to the veterans community and to the military community, and of course also trying to break down that stigma. Congress has done a fairly good job of addressing this, particularly over the past 4 years. As Senator Portman said in his previous remarks, passing CARA in 2016 was a big step forward. Congress also passed the Support Act in 2018, and also in 2018, Congress passed the VA Mission Act. These 3 laws together, 2 of them broadly about opioid issues with specific sections on veterans, and the last one, the VA Mission Act, a broader issue around veterans that had specific provisions for opioids, made a variety of changes to systems within VA around recruitment, funding, changing prescription drug monitoring program rules, revisions to the clinical practice guidelines around chronic pain and opioid therapy, as well as the opioid safety initiative. But like any area of public policy reform, it's very clear that a lot more needs to be done. My paper provides a series of policy proposals and solutions that will help in the next steps to address this. It was heartening to hear Senator Portman talk about the need to do more in Congress, really focusing attention on this. 2 that I'm going to discuss very briefly here at the open that I think needs a lot of thought, a lot of conversation, and a lot of action. And I was, again, grateful to hear that Senator Portman is serious about both of these. The first is understanding the opioid crisis as a long-term health policy challenge. As the rate of increase in overdoses begins to come down, and then eventually the number of overdoses coming down, it's important for Congress and whichever administration is in power to recognize that that is not a mission accomplished banner. If we lower the number of drug overdoses from 71,000 a year to 61,000 a year, that's great progress, but it still means 61,000 people overdosed. That means that, and as Senator Portman said, when you start to see progress, that's a reason to double down on the effective efforts that Congress is taking and the administration is taking, and not to pull back. And finally, the other important point, and again, Senator Portman touched on this, is thinking about opioid policy during a crisis. We are currently in a multi-part crisis that can drive up anxiety, it can cause conditions to worsen, and in particular around the pandemic, it can cause people seeking healthcare, including mental health care, not to get that healthcare in the way that they normally would. That increases the likelihood of substance use disorders, broadly opioid use disorders specifically, and then of course using other types of substances that may interact with prescribed medications and runs the risk of overdoses and of course deadly overdoses. Those are things that really need to be the focus of attention moving forward, as well as a variety of other subjects that I mentioned in the paper that, as Claire mentioned, is available on the Brookings website.
Thank you so much, John. Next, we are going to turn to Peter Reuter to talk about domestic law enforcement. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much. I'm talking about a paper that I wrote with Bryce Pardoe of the RAND Corporation, and we address the issue of how to deal with supply challenges for synthetic opioids, so really sort of the third phase of the opioid crisis, involving particularly fentanyl. And as Senator Portman said, the number of deaths there is really unprecedented. And in our view, it represents the fact that this is a different kind of drug crisis from ones that we've had before, because this is a supply-driven problem, not a demand-driven problem. There's not a new demand for fentanyl. Fentanyl has turned out to be a cheap drug relative to heroin for people who sell in illegal opioid markets. We estimate that if you sort of take into account differences in potency, at the kilogram level, fentanyl is only 1% as expensive as heroin. So dealers have an enormous incentive to substitute fentanyl for heroin. And one of the big puzzles is as to why fentanyl is really only sold in some of the country. There are a few states, in particular, Senator Portman's Ohio, West Virginia, and New Hampshire, in which the overdose death rate is 25 per 100,000, whereas on the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington, the rate is less than 1/10 of that. So what's extraordinary is that we have these unprecedented levels of drug overdoses, even though synthetic opioids, the principal driver, are still basically a regional phenomenon. What we were interested in is also sort of the problems of how you manage the markets for illegal opioids when synthetic opioids are available. The product is much more potent. It really represents a challenge for a dealer to sort of, even if he has a sense of responsibility, to be able to sell safely, because you're now dealing with micrograms, not just milligrams. Very hard to provide consistent dosing. And again, as Senator Portman said, it's even more dangerous because it's mixed with other drugs. There is in most of the country very little sale of pure fentanyl as fentanyl. It appears either mixed with heroin, as counterfeit prescription opioids, or increasingly with stimulants, cocaine and methamphetamine. And so the problem for law enforcement, at least in part, is how to manage these markets and make them less dangerous to the users. And so what we tried to do was develop an approach that took into account that the traditional goals of raising prices and reducing availability were probably ineffective given the ease of manufacture and distribution of synthetic opioids. And we're using here an approach that has been developed elsewhere by David Kennedy and the late Mark Kleiman called focused deterrence. The notion here is that you try to reduce not so much the market itself, but sort of a lot of the problems that the market generates. It was used, developed initially to deal with violence around open air drug markets. The notion was to publicize the behavior that will not be tolerated, which isn't just selling drugs, but selling drugs with violence, signaling credible threats to whoever does violate this, targeting the most egregious offenders, ensuring that there's a high probability of prosecution if you are targeted. And so what we've tried to do is use that model as a way of thinking about enforcement in sort of synthetic opioid era. And I want to go back to the fact that the country has two kinds of markets with respect to synthetic opioids. Markets in which synthetic opioids are readily available and ones in which they're still very rare. And they represent two very different enforcement challenges. For markets where fentanyl, I'll just stick to fentanyl rather than talk about synthetic opioids, where fentanyl is rare, you're really trying to avoid the entry of fentanyl. So you want to signal to dealers that if they sell fentanyl, you will target them. And you want to give both dealers and users testing kits, I mean, strips are available, which will detect the presence of fentanyl. And so you can use that as a way of, along with monitoring, for example, treatment admissions, drug seizures, undercover buys, identifying any dealers who are selling fentanyl and try to keep fentanyl out. That's not going to work in a market where fentanyl is readily available. Now the question is, can you prevent the most irresponsible behavior? And there are at least two examples of behavior we're particularly concerned about. One is selling analogs that are even more potent than fentanyl, like carfentanil. And second is putting fentanyl in stimulants, because if someone's using methamphetamine and there's an opioid in it, then they're particularly vulnerable to overdose. And there are other indicia that you would use. But here, it's again not about trying to raise price, it's about targeting egregious dealers and behavior, trying to prevent behaviors that make matters worse. I mean, that's essentially about local enforcement. There is clearly a role for federal agencies, and it will involve things like maybe setting up fake sales platforms so that you sort of create mistrust in the online community as to whether a seller is a real seller or a fake seller. And we have a variety of suggestions of that kind of thing. But what I want to end with is saying all this is highly speculative. We do not know what works. What is required is a willingness to experiment with lots of different ways of enforcing, of aiming to reduce supply, or at least make suppliers more responsible in their behavior. And I look forward to seeing those experiments. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And we'll move on to Vanda.
Thank you. Peter just spoke about domestic law enforcement, and a fascinating and powerful idea in how to innovate in domestic law enforcement to reduce the most significant dangers of the opioid epidemic, particularly the risks of overdose from synthetic opioids. My role in the project has been to think about how to manage supply from abroad, and particularly how to manage supply from China, India, and Mexico. And to the extent that suppressing supply from China becomes effective, think about, anticipate where supply might move, expanding in India, but likely also taking off in Myanmar, and what to do about those countries. So for the purposes of today, I will speak about two aspects. I will speak about China and Mexico. Since 2013, China has been the principal source of supply of fentanyl for the US drug market. China is the principal supply of legal fentanyl. Legal fentanyl is a crucial opioid that is used widely for surgeries. We are seeing constantly a need for fentanyl during the COVID epidemic, as the use of fentanyl is necessary for intubating patients who will be on ventilators. But as Peter and Senator Portman spoke about, fentanyl is also enormously dangerous and carries very high risk of overdose. And so when used as part of substance use disorder, carries enormous risks. And it has been principally supplied since 2013 out of China. Both the Obama and Trump administration spent very significant diplomatic capital since that time to persuade China to crack down on the illegal supply of fentanyl to the United States. And those efforts finally last year in May 2019 resulted in changes in China's laws and in China's regulations. With China passing a new law and new regulation that mandated that all analogs of fentanyl, so all drugs that have the same basic molecular structure as fentanyl, but perhaps some other molecular composition of on top of that core molecular structure, will now be what's called scheduled. Essentially, it means that they cannot be legally produced or exported unless the government of China gives out special licenses for both production, sales, and exports abroad. And so the issue now at stake is, with this new regulation, that is what the United States has sought, this is the way that fentanyl class drugs are regulated in the United States, will China in fact diligently enforce this regulation? Will it have both the capacity and the will to do so? And both are a challenge for a variety of reasons. So in my paper on China, I reflect both on how policy has evolved, what kind of diplomatic efforts were necessary to get policy changed, but also then what are the obstacles, likelihood, and inducements for developing both the capacity and the will in China for that enforcement. And the capacity challenge is not small. After all, there are some 5,000 pharmaceutical firms in China, many other thousands of firms that produce chemicals, and several 100,000 of production facilities. Yet for this amount of production places that are legal production places, or at least semi-legal, informal ones that are not necessarily clandestine labs, China has had only some 2,000 inspectors for a very long time, which obviously means that most facilities are not inspected in any way most of the time for any kind of diversion of legal production taking place or any kind of side illegal production of fentanyl alongside with other drugs. And I'm not even talking about clandestine small labs that are not part of large production facilities. The issue of will is not a minor one either. After all, the United States and China are on the verge of a new Cold War. Just today, the news was that the United States government ordered the Chinese consulate in Texas to be shut down, which is just the latest in the tit for tat that we have been seeing for months, and significant deterioration of US-Chinese relations that, as I mentioned, are really bringing the two countries close to a Cold War, to really its cusp and potentially already initiation. So what is the likelihood then that China will enforce? In order to answer that, I looked at how China has treated several other sets of regulation and its enforcement. I look at how China has responded to its wildlife regulation with respect to tiger products, elephants, and ivory, and after the 2003 SARS epidemic, and after the current COVID-19 epidemic. I also look at how China has how the evolution. I also look at the evolution of the tobacco regulation in China and its enforcement. And finally, I look at great detail at how China cooperated with Australia in preventing the production of methamphetamine in China, in southern China, and its illegal exports and trafficking to Australia. That cooperation, what ultimately became known as Task Force Blaze, was the most intense law enforcement cooperation that China has mounted with another country. Out of those cases, the following pattern emerges. Overall, the government of China at first tends to deny that there is a problem that emanates from China and that the government or China overall are in any way responsible. During this period of denial, very powerful vested interests emerge that comprise industry representatives, traders, officials of line ministries, and other government officials, often at local lower levels of government. Eventually, however, under either international pressure or intense domestic pressure, the government of China does move toward regulation. When that happens, it also mounts enforcement. I believe Senator Portman mentioned that, for example, we have seen a significant reduction in the supply of fentanyl from China via post office, which was enormously dangerous, including for postal workers. And under US collaboration with China, China mounted an effort to curtail that. Nonetheless, the supply of precursors from China to other countries like Mexico, as well as of produced fentanyl smuggled via cargo to Mexico or the United States persists. Nonetheless, even when China does move toward some enforcement, that enforcement often runs into very powerful vested interests that are very effective in subverting regulation, preventing its effective implementation. And the tobacco industry in China is a classic example, but it's a very consistent pattern over the other cases as well. And finally, we see that when production in China becomes very significantly reduced or eliminated, such as in the case of meth and moves abroad. In the case of meth, it was to Myanmar. China often loses an interest then in collaborating intensely in suppressing the problem, even when other linkages to China exist, such as, for example, traffickers continue to be Chinese nationals, perhaps the very same traffickers that at first orchestrated production in China and now are orchestrating production in Myanmar. Moreover, the other dimension of the pattern that's very significant is that to the extent that geopolitical interests are aligned with enforcing regulation, the enforcement gets done. To the interest that geopolitical interest goes in a different direction, perhaps against enforcement, then the geopolitical interests win. So in this context, it is rather unlikely that China will mount any kind of cooperation with the United States as intense as was Operation Task Force Blaze with Australia. But China will likely, to some extent, make some effort to maintain enforcement. So how can the United States then work with China, even in the context of a very significantly deteriorated relations between two countries, to have as effective enforcement as possible? Well, I outlined a detailed set of recommendations, but let me just talk about 4 broad categories and not get very significantly into the details. So in the first category, it's US government relations with the government of China. And here, the United States should make an effort to delink the counter-narcotics collaboration from the overall relationship. Avoid having counter-narcotics be another tool in the tit-for-tat dynamic that's taking place. And emphasize to China its own sense of identity. China has positioned itself to be a key counter-narcotics leader in Asia. It's increasingly taking on the role of a global drug cop at international fora. And so the United States can emphasize that sense of identity and interest on the part of China, and work also with the United Nations and European Union to harness that to encourage enforcement. But the US does not simply have to rely in its policies on direct government to government relations. Chinese pharmaceutical firms are major supplier of all kinds of drugs to the United States, including, as I mentioned, fentanyl. Thus, the US can mount its own regulation that mandate that all firms that seek to sell illegal fentanyl in the United States, or possibly even other drugs, implement the best practices that are adopted in the pharmaceutical sector. That is mostly lacking in China. One simple element of those best practices are closed circuit TVs system, so that the problem of having just 2,000 monitors for hundreds of thousands of facilities is reduced. But it's just one small element of a whole range of best practices that are mostly not adopted in China, and the awareness of which in China is limited. The US can also develop packages of leverage with key Chinese pharmaceutical and chemical industry CEOs, officials, and of course develop packages, legal enforcement indictment portfolios with respect to traffickers, even if the United States will not always be able to persuade China to arrest the individuals, and despite the fact that there is no extradition treaty between China and the United States. Nonetheless, one dimension of the problem that will continue to be enormously challenging, and perhaps the most challenging element, is the export of fentanyl and precursor agents from China to Mexico. Mexico is the principal conduit of all kinds of drugs to the United States, whether this is methamphetamine, whether this is cocaine, and now also opioids. The issue of opioids is twin in Mexico. There is heroin production, poppy cultivation, and heroin production in China. In fact, in Mexico. In fact, that was the second phase of the opioid epidemic in the US before fentanyl emerged. And now Mexico is also perhaps the principal conduit, the principal transshipment area for fentanyl. So what kind of policy options does the United States have with respect to Mexico, and what kind of policy options does the Mexican government have? Well, with respect to opium, poppy, and heroin, the dominant response for decades has been one of eradication. That response has not been popular with the government of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, but nonetheless has been at the core of US demands of Mexico. Forced eradication promises to deliver fast results. It can quickly suppress poppy, but often, and most of the times, those results, the suppression, are not sustainable, not even in the short term. And they often come with a variety of negative side effects. The reason that the suppression is not sustainable is because in the absence of effective state presence and legal livelihoods, farmers have a variety of ways to adapt and replant after eradication. And a crop like poppy can really be planted at least twice, sometimes even 4 times a year. So even after eradication, replanting will often produce a second or even 2 crops that will be able to produce a sufficient amount of the resin for production of heroin. Moreover, eradication strengthens the bonds between local populations and drug trafficking groups, thus significantly worsening law enforcement problems and weakening the legitimacy and political capital of the state. An issue that will become all the more important as COVID has greatly weakened the financial and other capacities of Mexico, a country that faces a GDP loss of perhaps as much as 8% of GDP, enormous economic hit, where at least 40% of the population before COVID existed in poverty, and where the issue of violence is enormous in the criminal market. So a different policy option would be alternative livelihoods. I speak in the paper quite in detail about what it would take to get to effective alternative livelihoods. a policy I believe in many ways is superior to eradication, but nonetheless, long way off. So more realistically, what both heroin and both addressing heroin and addressing fentanyl will require is interdiction strategies. I also talk about opium poppy licensing in Mexico, and I don't believe that is a strategy that will solve the issue. In fact, if Mexico wants to license opium poppy, it first needs to resolve its violence. It first needs to be able to mount far more effective rule of law than the current brazen out of control market. So we go back with respect to both fentanyl and heroin to interdiction. Let me make some few comments. Like Peter and Bryce in his paper, I was looking at the capacity to mount focused deterrence strategies in Mexico to dissuade Mexican criminal groups from principally smuggling fentanyl. And several years ago, I believe when fentanyl emerged in the US and Mexican groups like Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación moved into smuggling fentanyl, I believed that there was a possibility for effective focused deterrence strategies to suppress the cartel and suppress the level of smuggling. That train has now left the station. I no longer believe that for a variety of reasons, we can really get to interdiction in Mexico that can function as a behavior shaping strategy. And we are essentially left with interdiction as incapacitation. So let me, in the last minute or so, quickly talk about some of the policy dimensions with respect to interdiction. First, Mexico should prioritize anti-corruption and interdiction efforts in maritime ports that are key transshipment hubs for synthetic opioids and precursors. This is also a policy that would be consistent with the interest of the López Obrador administration that overall has not been interested and willing to go after drug trafficking groups. In my view, that's a critical mistake and failure of security policies of the Mexican government. It's something that the US needs to continue engaging Mexico on and demanding and persuading Mexico that going after the DTOs and criminal groups is vital for any kind of security and public safety. But nonetheless, an easy dimension of that is to focus on cleaning up the ports. The United States can also assist Mexico in targeting packages that are particularly linked to fentanyl, but it should do so in a way that emphasizes not high-value targeting, the dominant interdiction approach that compounds violence levels in Mexico, and instead focuses on interdicting the middle layer of the drug smuggling networks. And to persuade the López Obrador administration that those policies are not just in the interest of the United States, but also in the interest of Mexico, it's important to highlight that fentanyl abuse, fentanyl use and addiction and overdose is already becoming manifest in Mexico. It's become, for example, an enormous problem in Tijuana, and it's likely to go much further. And from just the public health crisis prevention policy, trying to limit the amount of fentanyl flowing into Mexico and through Mexico is critical. There are many more dimensions of the recommendations, but I will leave it to our conversation and the question and answer period. Claire, over to you.
Thank you so much, Vanda, and thank you also to Peter and John for those really thoughtful comments. We have given us a lot to talk about. We are a little bit behind schedule, so we're going to have a bit of an abridged Q&A. So I just was hoping that I could get you guys to each talk briefly about this moment we find ourselves in right now. Obviously, COVID is consuming a lot of the public attention, as well as the public healthcare infrastructure, I would guess. What happens now with all of these very smart ideas? Who do you pass the baton to? And how worried are you about whether the pandemic will delay progress on fighting the opioid epidemic? Maybe we could just go in the same order where we started. John John, how do you feel about going first on that one?
Sure, that's fine. Thanks, Claire, for the question. Yeah, obviously, the current pandemic and recession is turning a lot of what we know about public policy on its head. As I noted earlier, I think people failing to get the healthcare that they need, failing to keep up with substance treatment programs, et cetera, during this time is a reality. And we're going to need to craft a type of emergency rescue plan for a lot of those individuals who are going to have relapses, who are not going to be reducing opioid intake in the way that doctors would want. And there's going to be spillover effects as well. I think outside of the veterans issue specifically that I've written about, but I think more generally on this policy, one of the things that we have to remember is that while Senator Portman has shown incredible leadership on this and Congress has stepped up in the past few years, opioid treatment, opioid policy tends to be administered largely at the local and state levels. And as local and state governments are seeing massive reductions to their revenue, their tax revenue and fee revenue this year, there are going to have to be budget cuts somewhere. And those budget cuts are going to be painful. And we have to think about making smart cuts, obviously, but one area that we can't is an area where the problems are increasing by virtue of the problem. And I think substance use disorders are we already have data that substance use disorders are increasing during this time. And the worst thing that state and local governments could do is pull back during this period of recession, not just in the macroeconomy, but in public financing.
So in my view, we should look beyond COVID. COVID is a temporary problem, whether we're talking about another 6 months or another 18 months. I think 18 months is probably extended. And all the issues we're dealing with here are long-term. So let's separate what we need to do to deal with sort of how the problem worsens during this period. And I do not have good ideas about that, but sort of focus on what are the long-term approaches that we should be taking and making sure that we put in place the capacity to undertake those things. And as I suggest, we know so little about this particular phenomenon of synthetic opioids that on the supply side, that we need a lot of experimentation, and COVID is not, I think, sort of should not interfere with that, but we shouldn't be too COVID focused in thinking about strategies here.
Well, let me perhaps follow up quickly on the international dimension. So already COVID has become a very significant flashpoint between the United States and China. And a lot of the Trump administration rhetoric about foreign virus, Chinese virus has been enormously counterproductive in both motivating China to mount the kind of international collaboration that's necessary for addressing the pandemic and for easing the level of tensions between China and the United States to enable broader cooperative relations. What is also likely to happen, not just China, but in places like India as well, another major supplier of fentanyl and other synthetic drugs to the United States, is that the vested interest, powerful pharmaceutical companies, for example, will become even more powerful. In India, they are much less regulated than even in China. The regulatory and monitoring capacity of the Indian government is far less than that of China. And like in the United States, like in China, the pharmaceutical industry in India is very, very powerful and very important in the election. It is also a source of jobs. So we are likely going to face a perfect storm as COVID undermines jobs, takes jobs away from countries like in India, that powerful pharmaceutical industries will be more effective in preventing regulation and monitoring that needs to take place. In Mexico, that same problem is developing with respect to the illegal actors. The government capacity is undermined by COVID, government capacity that was always weak. Few of our viewers might have seen the absolutely astounding and extraordinary images of presumably a Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación armored vehicle convoy that came out several days ago, clearly threatening the state, clearly threatening other criminal groups in ways that the Taliban in Afghanistan or Al-Shabaab in Somalia would not dare do. So already weak capacity now further compounded by a significant decline of financial capacity for the state, of access, of physical access, and drug trafficking groups that have become the first responders to COVID in many parts of Mexico, providing packages of aid, handing out soap, sanitizers, food donations, financial donations, and will be also principal employers, including for illegal production of drugs and for smuggling of drugs. So a very difficult mix, but even with this very difficult mix and much worsened context, the policy recommendations that are put forward in the papers, in my view, still hold rather robustly, both during the crisis and beyond the crisis.
Vanda, you mentioned briefly what is the other sort of major news event happening this year that could potentially, I think, disrupt this conversation that we're having now. You know, the presidential election is just over 100 days away. What would an antagonistic presidential campaign, obviously, President Trump's, the core of his campaign is being tough on China, building a wall at the Mexican border, these two countries that are so central to the fight of fentanyl trafficking. I mean, would you talk about how you imagine a presidential campaign could impact those efforts and a potential change of leadership, depending on what happens in November?
Well, we just recently had the visit of President López Obrador in the United States to highlight the implementation of U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the trade agreement that replaces NAFTA, that new trade went into effect, and both leaders were celebrating it. And it was rather dramatic to see how friendly President López Obrador was with President Trump, and how much he has emphasized good relations between the two countries. In fact, the entire administration of President López Obrador has been one of bending backward to accommodate the Trump administration's desires, such as on migration, not one mentioning of the wall and the very negative effects that the wall is causing, not just in the United States, but also in Mexico. But nonetheless, the broader issue in the relationship, and one that will not change if Vice President Biden is elected, is the real deficiency and problematic approach of the López Obrador administration toward violence in Mexico and toward criminal and drug trafficking groups. The strategy of President López Obrador throws away the baby with the bathwater and just suspends any meaningful law enforcement action. So whether it's the Trump administration or the Biden administration, both will need to emphasize to Mexico how critical public safety is, and how launching much better, more effective law enforcement policies is necessary for Mexico. This is not just a problem of the gringos doing drugs. Tougher dimension yet with China. Clearly, if there is a Biden administration, it's possible that the level of tension between the two countries will be reduced. Nonetheless, there are larger issues that go deeper. I spoke about how the Obama administration had to struggle and work very hard with China to bring China to, for example, place the fentanyl class drugs on schedule. So the rivalry between the two countries is real, and it's not just a matter of the Trump administration, even though it's become particularly hostile in the Trump administration. And indeed, what is new about synthetic opioids is the way that they have changed the relationship between geopolitics and counter-narcotics policy. So for decades and decades, as the US shaped global counter-narcotics policy, was the principal architect and principal police officer of the counter-narcotics regime, it had to deal with drug supply coming from countries that were often countries in war or facing very intense insurgency, like Colombia or Afghanistan, but that were neither a peer rival or a peer partner. And the supply of synthetic opioids from China and from India changes dramatically. So a lot of the foreign policy business of counter narcotics is radically changed with synthetic opioids. And the fact that US simply cannot put the same kind of pressure and expect the same effectiveness against its peer competitor, nor against the country, India, whom the US seeks to be a principal partner in managing China's rise and China's behavior.
Thank you, Vanda. Peter, something jumped out at me in one of your papers, which was that it is illegal in some places for fentanyl test strips. I mean, maybe I'm the only person that was sort of surprised by that didn't know that, but that strikes me as really counterintuitive, really, in what we're trying to do here. We've gotten a couple of other questions, listener questions on that topic. So I just was hoping you might speak to these sort of basic harm reduction implementation. The reader question, the listener question is, in order to save lives and money and reduce crime, many European countries have adopted the Swiss model of heroin-assisted treatment. Why are there no discussions in USA regarding best practices in how to deal with the opioid crisis?
Sure. So let me take those two separately. So the fentanyl strips are sort of, I think, not singled out in law, that they're part of the drug paraphernalia laws. So the notion was you didn't want to allow the sale of anything that sort of facilitated, made safer drug use, because that would encourage drug use. And fentanyl test strips are just sort of another example of that. And many states, fortunately, have eliminated the paraphernalia laws, and hopefully more of them will do that, because it's really impossible to argue in favor of that. The heroin-assisted therapy is a topic of great interest. There are a number of countries, notably Switzerland and Netherlands and Germany, in which people who have a heroin dependency problem can, in a clinic, receive the heroin that they want under medical supervision. And there have been lots of studies of how well they function. And the answer is that they do much better in terms of employment, their health, and the sort of social functioning, all substantially better. And the question is, as was suggested, why has that not made any impact in this country? And I think the first thing to note is that though all the evaluations suggest that it works well in its own terms, it's not very attractive to heroin users. Only about 10% of heroin users in any of these countries actually take advantage of this, which is sort of fascinating phenomenon. Heroin users want to be self-sufficient. So this is by no means a magic bullet. This is not going, even if it was available here, there's no reason to believe it would make a huge difference. But I think that the attitude here amongst the public health and harm reduction advocates is that it's politically impossible to get an acceptance for the distribution of a drug which has been a demon drug for decades in this country. And secondly, I think they themselves are very uncomfortable with the notion of not treating, but just providing the drug. But it's really a fascinating and troubling question that there is no discussion of this. If I might be personal for a moment, I wrote an editorial about this, which was rejected without review by almost by half a dozen US public health journals, and then Lancet Psychiatry in Britain was happy to publish what I think is quite a decent one. But there's no interest in this topic, even in the professional community in this country.
We're running out of time, but I hope I can squeeze in one more question without getting in trouble. I have long heard people complain about the lack of up-to-date, comprehensive data about opioid use and overdose deaths. John, you mentioned this sort of bureaucratic red tape that often surrounds like prescription monitoring programs within the VA and probably in civilian medical settings as well. So I was just hoping, I spoke with a congressman the other day who said, well, our ability to track coronavirus cases and deaths in real time every day, as flawed as that might be and as incomplete as that might be, it shows that we have the capacity to do this if we choose to. So I was hoping, John, you might be able to talk about some of the bureaucratic challenges in getting real-time data and information that is needed for people like you and for other people working in the field to really understand and address what's happening on the ground in real time.
Claire, that's a great question. Also, my apologies if there's noise in the background. Here in DC, we are getting slammed by a thunderstorm right now. And so hopefully I don't lose power in the middle of this answer rather. It's a great question. COVID has shown us the ability to mobilize local and state level data and aggregate it in a very significant way in near real time. And we're not doing that in as effective of a way with opioids, with drug overdoses generally, et cetera. It shows, as I said, the capacity is there to do it, just the will and the funding needs to be there to make it happen. I think it is important. Vanda was talking earlier with the senator about alternative ways rather than just coroner reports, death certificates, public health entity reporting that can try to achieve what is going on within a local community. But the challenge, of course, in a system like the American model is that because information is so decentralized, we rely on state and local governments to report that information up. And not all states report data or collect data in exactly the same ways. It makes it difficult for the distribution and dissemination of that information. It also creates challenges for the analysis of that information. And what makes things even more challenging in this context, in particular when you're talking about prescription drugs, is that people get healthcare from multiple sources. Veterans do. Some veterans get private as well as VA healthcare. And a lot of times those systems are not talking to each other in the way that they need to in order for doctors to have the information they need in order to have a proper clinical setting, but also for public health researchers and public health officials to get the information that they need to make the most informed decisions. I think there are a lot of lessons we're going to learn about this current pandemic, and I think the ability and the willingness to report and aggregate data rapidly and systematically, and like you said, with the caveat that it is a flawed process, it is an imperfect process, but it's better than having to wait a year to get those data.
Yes, that makes sense. I mean, we just a few days ago found out how many people died in 2019. So there's certainly a delay that probably makes your all's work really hard. Well, thank you so much. I think we've run out of time. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and congratulations to you all for your work. Vanda, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Claire, for your work that has informed our work for a very long time. And thank you for your wonderful conversation today. Also, many thanks to Peter Reuter and John Hudak for joining me in the conversation today, and more importantly, for being crucial partners in the opioid project. The entire paper series, as well as the first webinar and podcast and today's webinar, are available at www.brookings.edu/opioid crisis. That has papers by Rosalie Pakula and Bradley Stein, Paul Kilmer, John Calkins and Pete Humphreys, Paul Weiss, Gia Ahmed, and Joshua Scharfstein, as well as my co-director, Keller Graham, and of course, the papers that we have been speaking about today by Peter Reuter and Bryce Pardo, and by John Hudak, as well as my papers. It also has a really wonderful podcast with some of the other authors in the series, and webinar one. I am very gratified to have been working with all those colleagues for over a year on this project, and I look forward to our work in helping to reduce an enormous, destructive, and tragic public health crisis in the United States. Thank you all for joining, engaging with us. We are sorry we couldn't take all your questions, of which we know there were many, but the papers get in great detail of many of the issues raised, such as harm reduction, such as medication-assisted treatment, data, regulations of industry, foreign policy dimensions, vulnerable groups. So I hope that you can log into them and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.